everybody. Thanks for joining me over here at the Independent Ink with Mr. Fish. I'm Mr. Fish. What follows is a conversation I recently had with three activist chums that I have known for a while. The first one is Terry Rankin, who, I met him through the work I was doing with Revolution 21, the Roger Hallam environmental group. So this was years ago. Terry and I often get together and just talk about philosophy and the meaning of life channeled through his faith and my lack of faith. And we tend to have a great time commiserating over doomsday. There is some hope in those conversations, but I wanted to include him because he's been around for quite a while, as you'll see from his self-introduction. He'll fill you in on some of that stuff. And then we have Anthony Rogers-Wright, who I worked with when I was the artistic director of sorts for the Cornel West presidential campaign. And Anthony has been around for a long time. You will see his enthusiasm, his passion, and his great verbosity and precision in giving a shit about things. So that is Anthony. And finally, I included in the conversation Natasha Hakimi Zapata, who I worked with at Truthdig for many years. She's a journalist and just wrote a book that is getting a lot of attention. This is It, Another World is Possible. We talk about that quite a bit. So my intention for this was to basically define what activism is, what its application might be given the times that we're in right now. Yeah, it's a strategy session, I guess, with people that approach the question of applying positive change to a dystopia from many different angles. So that's what we talked about. So here it is, our conversation. All right. While Terry cleans his glasses in preparation of white hot rage that is going to be coming out of those eyes.
Yeah, I'm going to melt the glass with my.
There we go. You're supposed to put those glasses on and say, I don't recognize anybody I'm sitting in front of. All right. So thanks for joining me today for this conversation about activism and what activism is and what we're supposed to be doing with this form of shit-givery, I guess is the best way to put it. And the way I would think I want to start this conversation is I'm going to go from person to person, so you can say who you are and what you think your focus is as a quote-unquote activist. Okay? So just looking at the screen, I will start with Terry.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, who I am and my focus as an activist?
Yeah, or just what you do. Why do you give a shit?
I can't not give a shit is the quick, dirty answer. I mean, I really don't have a choice. I date my dilettante days of activism were back in the 60s and 70s. And then I was just kind of showing up and hanging out. You know, I didn't really become an SDS or any of that, but I was just kind of hanging around the periphery and having conversations that were fascinating. And then I became a corporate drone for 30 years and finally retired from all that. And then I worked on a doctorate. And in doing my doctorate that I finished in 2019, I was focused on the shit that's hitting the fan, bottom line. And the title of the dissertation I wrote was The End Signs. Are you getting the message? Are we getting the message? And we're not. I mean, the vast majority of us are just simply not. They're going through life eyes wide shut still. And I can't just sit by and watch that happen because I have children and grandchildren. And those are the main drivers. And
well, let me interrupt you really quick too, because I'm curious. I don't even know if I know this answer. What kind of corporate work were you doing? I mean, you don't have to get too specific. It's totally up to you. But I'm always curious about somebody who has been in a belly of a beast and how that informs, the production of a beating heart and a human soul that now says, okay, I know what this looks like. I know what I disdain. And again, I'm building out like your corporate job is being the most reprehensible thing. I don't mean to be doing
Well,
that.
it's not entirely, you're not entirely off the mark. I mean, it was 30 years of a IT and AI career, basically. IBM, Oracle,
Mm.
then kind of contract and independent consulting work for a lot of smaller companies. Um, but the more I saw of the technology that was there, the more I began to envision where it was going.
And boy, did
And
it end up somewhere. I mean, it sounds
no
like you
shit. I
got
mean,
out.
in 1982, I was sitting in Chicago at one of the first two 1-800 Help Me numbers when we had analog phones with push buttons on them to take
Yeah.
calls. And I had just finished my master's in philosophy at the University of Kentucky. And so I was watching computers and I started following AI in 1982 when AI Magazine first came out. And I've been with it ever since, off and on. And that was the main thing, was recognizing just the extent. Even then, IBM had the largest satellite network of anybody, bigger than AT&T. And T.
Right.
And I began to see just how much control and power information and data had and still do. And it's just, I mean, it's gone multiple exponentials beyond where it was then.
Yeah.
And with what we're facing now with AI, I mean, I'm just talking about the technology. I'm
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
talking about the applications and how that's become a fascist regime that's gone global.
Yeah.
But I saw it coming in the 80s.
Yeah.
I just didn't have the language, even with a degree in philosophy. I didn't have the language to really come to grips with it. And that's
Yeah.
what I've been doing since the last decade.
Well, this is a great way to get over to Anthony, just because of what we were just briefly talking about before I hit record. Your recent forays into attempting to sort of blow the biggest megaphone in contempt of what AI is about. And again, we can sort of get into that a little bit, but Anthony, tell the folks who you are, and what you've been up to.
Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, pleasure to see you, brother. It's been way too long, and reminding me I got to get back to Philly for many, many reasons, including having a meal with you and your amazing partner. But my work, Anthony Rogers-Wright. I'm a policy fellow with the Movement for Black Lives, and an active member of Black Alliance for Peace. We, of course, met on Dr. West's presidential campaign. And, my work is primarily in climate and environmental liberation. And I use that term specifically, moving on from climate and environmental justice. As Comrade Terry just let us know, there are points in history and activism where you do have to change your approach, and that includes your nomenclature. When we talk about justice, we're talking about balance, right? It's not getting everything you want, but justice is rooted in balance, right? Lady Liberty or Lady Justice holding the scales, right? But we are at such a point in our planetary and human history, especially environmentally, where everything is so out of balance that it will require liberation until we can even begin speaking about any semblance of justice, right? Like, and this brings me back to people like Amilcar Cabral, the great comrade, and Lumumba and Nkrumah, all of the anti-colonial struggles. It's like we have to liberate ourselves before we get justice. And so that's where, a lot of my work is centered on is climate and environmental liberation, specifically for frontline communities, not just Black, Brown, and Indigenous, but as you know, Brother Fish, I mean, I'm in firm solidarity with our poor white communities, our Appalachian comrades. I am trying to bring us back to the days of Blair Mountain, multiracial, multi-ethnic class solidarity. And, our people, our poor white people in Appalachia are some of the most ardent freedom fighters and climate liberation fighters that I've ever met. And also really forming and the axiomatic nexus between militarism and climate injustices, right? Whether it is in Palestine and Gaza, massive environmental warfare, like just it's all about environmental warfare, right? And we also know that colonization has massive impacts on the natural and physical environment. It always has, and it always will. So this idea that you can't separate militarism from climate action, and this brings us to the advent of data centers and AI. I mean, when you think about and talk about the resource extraction alone, the amount of land it takes up, the amount of energy that's required. I mean, when it comes to energy appetite, these things are obese. That's the only way that we can describe them, right? And then, when we're talking about water, I mean, we are what, like, 4 or 5 years removed from the valiant indigenous-led Standing Rock uprising, and that was the main saying, right? Minnie was showing, water is life, and the amount of water that these data centers, use up. I think the estimate is like for every AI query, you're using about 2 gallons of water, and that is a major problem, for me. The conversation stops, right there when
Yeah.
we're talking about water. And as I was just telling you, I just got back from the Great Lakes region. The Great Lakes represent 26% of the world's remaining surface freshwater. Okay, it used to be 15% 10 years ago. The fact that it's gone up to 26% means that we are losing freshwater systems around the world. And so the fact that they are even talking about placing data centers in the Great Lakes region, it's like, no, 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 no. We have to address this, right away. So we are starting something called the Great Lakes Water Justice Initiative, because when you think about the fact that Great Lakes also are the cities that have the highest populations of Black people north of the Mason-Dixon line, right? These are some of the blackest cities in the country: Buffalo, Cleveland, obviously Chicago, and Detroit, and Milwaukee, all sitting on these Great Lakes. If we don't have a plan in place for what we're going to do to protect that water, and which is to say nothing about the indigenous people all around the Great Lakes region who depend on that water for sustenance and cultural aspects of their life, we're going to have ourselves a real big problem. And then, what I will say is that to me, AI, big tech, who are forging with big oil cartels as well, it represents, what late stage capitalism is doing to survive. Right. And this is an affront to everything that we care about, consolidation, monopolization, hypercapitalism, massive resource extraction, increased surveillance and increasing of the police state. And then, of course, we know that there is a direct connection between big tech and big genocide taking place in Palestine, right now. The Palestinians are just being killed because they look like someone who IDF, or IOF, I should say, was looking for. So major issues, but that informs my work. Climate environmental liberation. You tell me what we can do if we don't have water. You can't make water with AI.
Well, that's the thing. That's what's funny about that, because I do think that there's a great there's this belief that has always justified the creation of technologies that actually are rendered in complete contempt for the species,
Right.
with the assumption that we will be able to use the technology that we want to develop to save ourselves.
That's right. That's
And
right.
there's a long history of just that never, ever being the case. And just to
That's
hear
right.
you just talk about how uh, everything you're naming about what is treacherous and bad about right now, these are fights that have been going on for a very long time,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly.
And the lethality is just increased because the technologies of death have increased, and the
Yep.
efficiency of that has increased. But these are storied, long narratives that everybody should be able to connect those dots just to see the danger that we're in, which then brings us to Natasha. Now, Natasha, you can tell us who you are and what I see Anthony, you know, saying here is, in many ways, what can we learn from history, and what can we learn? How can we apply a strategy moving forward that can wake people up to the fact that this has happened before, and you can talk about your new fantastic book that is thrilling everybody, as a strategy on what can we learn from history, and what can we do about making the future better.
Well, first of all, Dwayne, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be in conversation with you and Anthony and Terry here. And so, yeah, I mean, I've been a journalist for about 15 years now in progressive media. Dwayne and I worked together at Tristig for many years. And during that time, so I say that there are two sort of sides to my why or for my reason for being a journalist. And for writing this book that I just wrote that you've alluded to called Another World is Possible, which is lessons for America from around the globe. There it is, and it's all its pink glory. It's from the New Press. It came out earlier this year. And so part of that is that experience that I had in journalism, writing and editing and reporting and commissioning pieces from the left in the US and seeing how we would sort of take these 2 steps forward, 2 steps backward, or many more steps backwards, while at the same time, I had the privilege of living in a number of different countries around the world in which some of the problems that we're facing in the US that seem totally intractable have either been solved or at least they've gotten a lot further along. And I'll talk a little bit about sort of the biggest issue that radicalized me, and that's healthcare, which comes from the personal side of things, the personal side of my why, which is I'm the daughter of undocumented immigrants from Mexico and Iran, and my brothers and I really grew up as these little American dreams that my parents had. We're all the first to go to get college degrees in our family. And at the same time that this narrative was so strong in my family, as soon as we all started to experience how different places treat people differently, it actually started to feel like that American dream that my parents had for a dignified life was actually more possible in some of the places that I had lived or visited. And a lot of that came from a health incident with my mom, where my mom, who's from Mexico, couldn't afford health care, health insurance for many years. And by the time she her diabetes had been diagnosed, she was being rushed to an emergency room and had to have her right foot amputated. And at that moment in which I was getting that call, which I write about, uh, I had this deep concern, of course, for her well-being, for her future, for how she was going to survive moving forward, something that we've all probably are familiar with, unfortunately. But on the other side, and this felt to me American in experience, I was experiencing this added dread of how are we going to afford the care she needs moving forward? How are we going to afford the insulin she needs to stay alive? And I had lived in places with universal health care like the UK where I live now. And so I knew that this didn't have to be the case. I knew that we could do better. And that's what I wanted to do with this book is sort of share the stories of places that are doing better. And they're all imperfect policies, they're all imperfect places. And yet they're so much further along on certain issues than we've been able to get in the US.
Just like I was saying earlier, just like you were alluding to, um, what's great about the book is that it really is at least one half, 3/4 of some deep dives into history. And again, it's so important to make the connection that simplistically speaking, we are stories. Each of us is a story. Right. Now, if we can understand the story of ourselves, the story of our families, the story of our communities, the story of our region, all of that sort of stuff, you start to figure out the common humanity. All of a sudden, it becomes harder and harder to codify people into different stratas of importance and all of those things that make codifying different kinds of prejudices and then justifying them later becomes impossible when you know that we are all human beings that share similar vulnerability and similar needs and all of those things. So that's one of the things also I just want to emphasize about your book is that it really does. It's about the human heart. It's a humanitarian argument. And I think that's one of the things that I would say, just listening to each one of you talk about why you're involved in this kind of work, is because you give a shit about human beings. you know, and it is pushing past the politics of different kinds of segregations. And that's one thing that I find interesting about you, Anthony, is that I think out of for the four of us here, you're somebody who the hats that you wear are interesting to me because on the one hand, you're a really radically humane activist who the fire in your belly is I've not it's there and it's extreme and it's very passionate and it's very inspiring. But then, you are somebody who actually interfaces with bureaucrats. You'll put a jacket on and you will put your glasses on and you will go talk to people on the state and federal level and you will sort of speak in their language, not losing any of the fire that you have inside of you. But it's sort of the lingual component of what do I have to say? How do I have to say it? How do I serve the moment that I'm in right now to get the best result for the greatest number of people who are suffering? And I find that interesting. So if you can just talk about that as something that you have developed a great deal of from my perspective, a great deal of expertise doing, and how hard is that? How easy is that? What does that mean for your mission? How frustrating can it be, and how rewarding can it be? I know it's
Well,
a
yeah,
lot.
yeah, it definitely requires a lot of compartmentalization, for sure. I mean, kind of like Comrade Terry, my background was originally in like more corporate environmentalism, right? Like writing documents for the National Environmental Policy Act and California Environmental Quality Act. That was the job that I could get, at the time. And I didn't really shift more to environmental activism until like 2015, when I realized this is not actually protecting the environment. It is doing the bare minimum to allow things to get built as it pertains to, protection. The fire in my belly, that's definitely from my mom, the great Dr. Mary Ann Rogers-Wright. I mean, this is a woman who, when I would get sent to the principal's office for fighting bullies, would pick me up and take me out for ice cream, and like, that's fine with me, as long as he got in trouble for something righteous, like that's good. I'm not picking up because he cheated on a test or because he picked a fight. I mean, he was helping people who were helpless. So that has always stuck with me. Our dear brother, great Dr. Cornel West, always preaches this idea of an inside and outside game, right? And there are some folk who don't see the agency of going in on the inside. And I totally and absolutely respect that, because sometimes I absolutely feel the same way. And to that end, I feel that makes me more authentic, because I always go into the inside with full accountability to the folk who are on the outside. And, our motto at Black Alliance for Peace is no compromise, no retreat. So, when I'm going in there, and sometimes it's made me a bit of a pariah, with certain congressional Hill staffers and whatnot, it's like nothing is changing, and you're not going to get me to compromise and go back on the outside and say, hey, folk, we just do this a little bit and do that, maybe we can get closer to what we want. That may have worked. And this is no criticism of, the great Dr. Martin Luther King, who certainly had to make some compromises, to at that time, advance some pretty important policy. Whether they're still intact is a whole nother question and discussion. But you could see those contradictions when you had the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party, Dr. King making some really bad compromises that just pissed off, the great Fannie Lou Hamer and Bob Moses, who basically said, Solomon couldn't have split that baby in half any better than you just did. So it's taking, those lessons as well. But it's also to remind, these folk who are on the inside that we're out here and we're out there, and we're going to bring our voices, on the inside as well. But it's definitely not always easy. I mean, I have high contempt for many of the Democrat Party Hill staffers who, I do have to work with sometimes, because mainly it's just telling you your boss just doesn't get it, or your boss is bought by, Democrat Majority for Israel or AIPAC. This is not helpful at all. But yes, some compartmentalization, because I think that, there's kind of two kinds of activism at this point. I'd love to hear how if Terry and Natasha kind of like agree. On the one hand, you have now activism has been centralized, one portion that's been centralized and institutionalized, totally under the thumb of philanthropic foundations that have no intent of giving us the money that is needed to make the transformation, because that would be a suicidal mission, because we would be killing them to some extent as well. But then you have this grassroots, people-centered, and fully independent activism. We've seen it in your cartoons, Brother Fish. We've seen it in Natasha's reporting, and I know we've seen it in Comrade Terry's work as well. And that's, the side of activism that I want to be on and always bring inside of just, I will talk to you, but speaking to me in no way means that you are speaking to the people. Right. Every time a lawmaker who's either running for office likes to say, "Oh, can I pick your brain about something?" No, I take my cues from the great Charles Barron, intrepid and unbought, New York City, New York State politician that, no, you can come and talk to my people with me. Right. But what you're not going to do is kind of like try to make me into some charismatic leader that speaks for every single Black person,
Yeah.
because if I could speak for every single Black person, none of them would be Democrats. I don't have that power. Right? So, you need to come in here from a dynamic community. But yeah, it's hard. But I mean, also, I do like to put on a jacket and a nice shirt, because my lovely partner says I clean up nicely. And
You do. It's true. We'll pause here where people go and do an image search of you in a
that's
jacket.
right.
No, but this is a great way also to segue in, because there's two things you mentioned in your answer that is one of the key things when it comes to activism. You talk about needing to interface with bureaucracies, and hierarchies that are like locked in with, corporate power brokers who are there to sort of, their interests are there, and so forth. So you're stepping into a situation where the parameters of the discussion are sort of set, right? And you've got to go in and figure out how to navigate with a more humane voice and try to sort of like resonate something, inside of those spaces. Also inside of there is that question. It's always been very interesting to me, and also very, very depressing, is how can we finance a way to save the species? Do you know what I mean? To where there's a Kurt Vonnegut quote that I've always liked, which was, "We could have saved ourselves, but we were too damn cheap." Right. So if the scenario involves an economic model that can support justifying being decent to each other, being kind to the environment, looking to a future that is habitable by human beings, that's a kind of existential illogic that really needs to be looked at. And this is when Terry and I have had these conversations for years now. And Terry is somebody who you can see the frustration on his face, because he and I do a very similar thing. We contemplate these issues from a perspective that does not want to figure out a strategy. We want to figure out, what does this really mean? He does it through his faith, and he does it through his philosophical curiosities. I do it through my art and also my philosophical curiosities and whatever spirituality that I think that I inhabit. We do that in our rooms. This is what it should be. And then it's just like, okay, now we've got to bring the private discovery into the public space, which doesn't have anywhere to put this thing. Now I've got to figure out how to chop this up into fun-sized pieces that people are going to understand. And then it becomes this thing where it's just like, you end up in a place that you alluded to a little bit, Anthony, of needing to figure out how to, A, get in the door, B, stay in the room, C, be invited back, because there is a way to try to remind people that, A, this is very serious. We do have to speak more frankly about it. The imperative is a time issue at this point. It's not a way of how are we going to figure out how to be polite about screaming, there's a fucking fire, as the house is burning down, right? So Terry, talk to me about that, because I know that that is something that you have dealt with, having gone through your corporate place, but then going and becoming like a scholar of people who are just trying to get to the core of what it means to be a human being and how do we sustain ourselves as a community of human beings.
You don't ask much, do you?
Well, you cleaned your glasses. You're ready for
Oh,
this.
yeah, okay, okay. I, having spent the last 6, 7 years with some really heavy duty frontline leaders, Roger Allen, Robin Boardman in Revolution 21 in particular, and going back 5 or 6 years to early Extinction Rebellion, I've been in that world far more than I've been in the other world. But in the last year and a half, I've kind of taken a smaller background enabler role. I run their Zoom account basically for their big events, their conferences. But what I'm doing more is more writing, just Substack stuff and some personal stuff. But what I've been trying to do more, let me put it in context. I live in central western Florida, between Orlando and Tampa. I live under the thumb of MAGA at every turn, on every corner, in 9 out of 10 houses within walking distance. That's the world I live in. That's my front line. And just yesterday, I know my 4 neighbors on the 4 sides of our house. Just yesterday, I spent about an hour and a half, first time that I've gotten to know the one that well next to me. This is where I'm at work today, is that one-on-one, how do I touch you without talking about anything? Because that's what has to happen, I think. If I can't get in a situation face to face with somebody, and Fish, I've never met you face to face, ironically,
Yeah.
but we've become BFFs,
Right.
So, but getting in a room one-on-one or one-on-two or three, where it's small enough that people have to be opened up, they have to talk, they have to answer, they have to ask. One at a time, one voice, one exchange, and it's like skating on glass with saws on your skates because you're going to put scratches in the surface.
Right.
And it's delicate. You don't know how thin that glassy ice is. And we spent an hour and a half talking, and we talked about a couple of things where you could begin to feel differences. We didn't name them. We didn't go dig into them. We didn't pick at them. But you just begin to feel that they're there. In the next conversation, we will name a couple of them probably.
Right.
Excuse me. Odds are they'll be political.
Right.
Odds are they'll be spiritual. Odds are that because being a Christian, yes, but I'm closer to Hedges than I am to Cornell. In that sense, okay? I'm more of the Christian anarchist than I am I don't like the word proselytizer, but Brother West is really a proselytizer, You can't not feel his face when you're even online with it. Love the man. But anyway, here's what worries me. What worries me is what I saw happen in Rev 21, Hallam and Boardman. Brilliant activists, both of them. Hearts as big as the planet and love unconditionally for anyone and everyone all the time. But two people cannot lead a movement. I firmly believe that. You have to have three. Otherwise, there's no tiebreaker. And you can't have a lot more than three because you have to have, don't want to say control, but you have to find a dynamic among at least three people that generates what I call resonance, harmony, and synchrony in the surroundings, whether it's just the three of you or the 3,000 or the 3 million. If you don't have some kind of resonance, harmony, and synchrony, almost beyond description, just a felt truth and reality about who you are and what you're about, Getting to that is the challenge because right now, sorry, I need some water. Right now, in the activist community, in my experience, everybody wants to be an influencer.
Right.
Everybody wants their ideology, their values, their demands, their principles, their mission, their purpose. And that's just what corporations do.
Right. Well,
So
this
we
is,
have this corporate model of activism,
yeah,
and it ain't going to work.
right. Well, this is, and so this, and so I want to put this to Natasha, and then we can sort of, I don't mean to keep going from one to the next and everything. I'm sort of, I hope I'm not killing any conversations that could be
I'm going to get some
happening.
water. I'll be right back. I can
Okay.
hear you.
Okay. Um, but it's in your book, Natasha, there is the seismic changes that have contributed to making things better for a community have a certain groundswell feature to it. You know, yes, there is leadership. You know, yes, I understand that keeping just in any sort of organization, um, allowing for the implementation of an agenda of a mission. Yes, if we can keep it somewhat focused, that is key for an implementation of an agenda. But at the same time, there have been very meaningful shifts in societies that had to do with the removal of those kinds of strategies and allowing a community to recognize something that exists without a bureaucracy or a hierarchy um, giving them permission to experience. I've brought this up in different discussions where when I had a classroom, I would talk to my students about this. Uh, Many of which, this was at the University of Pennsylvania, and I would always ask, how many people have done activism work? How many people have gone to a protest? One or two, right? This is a privileged community, right? And I'm always curious to test the pulse of a privileged community when it comes to how they see human rights, what they're allowed to do, free speech, academic freedom, all of those things. And it seems that, you know, middle class, privileged people up above that have this idea that rights are given to them and then they enjoy them. Where the reality is no, people who are in power, we make them recognize rights that are intrinsic to human beings already. And that's a huge difference that people have got to recognize. Right. And there have been historical examples, and Natasha, this is what I want you to talk about, where it's a matter of getting politicians literally out of the way and saying, you're not even part of this discussion anymore, because rather than me going to you and begging and figuring out what my compromises are going to be to allow you to maintain the power that you have right now, to then give me a few crumbs to make me feel like I've succeeded. No way. We've seen it. I remember, and this is just the example that I'll give, that was shocking to me years ago when the whole conversation about gay marriage, Obama was president, right? And so there should be a right between, inside the queer community of the sanctity of marriage. If you want to recognize it and you want to partake, you should be able to get married. Even Obama, if you remember, was just like, he had his finger in the wind and was just like, no, I think it really should be between a man and a woman, right? And that I was amazed and thrilled by the fact that this culture and the society was just like, the fuck is that? Why am I even asking this person, right? Just like, and so all of a sudden this groundswell that I was talking about went across where it was just like, no, guess what? We deserve the same privilege. So then, Obama had to go through the sort of the charade and the theater of being, after, careful deliberation. I think, again, it's just, I can't stand the performative nonsense sometimes that we have to sit and endure to get to the end of something where there's this realization that human decency should trump what politics are attempting to sort of mute and minimize inside of a culture. So if you could talk about that from your examination of these shifts that actually gave a community what the community deserves because it's an inherent right as a living organism. Um, Talk about your experience in sort of discovering those kinds of activisms that sort of were organic and spontaneous, much more than, curated.
I looked at very different policies, in very different countries, right? So I went everywhere from New Zealand to look at universal pensions to Uruguay to look at their state-owned utility that did something that hadn't been done before, which was transition to green energy in less than 10 years, to back to where I live to the UK to look at the founding of the first universal healthcare system and a number of other places in between. And one of the big lessons that I think is really relevant to the point we're in right now in the US and elsewhere is that a lot of these seismic shifts in broader society actually came out of very dark periods. So to look at the National Health Service again, which is, again, really close to my heart and one of my favorite stories in the book, is that this comes out of the ashes of World War II. You have as a Britain that has been totally devastated by war. And rather than continue with the right wing Tory party under Winston Churchill, which had led them through World War II, they decide to vote them out and vote in the first Labour government. And this direction that it led the country on, and things have shifted unfortunately back to the right in many ways in the UK, but that led to the founding of the National Health Service, to these amazing public housing projects throughout the whole country, and a number of other incredible, what we would consider sort of radical left-wing policies to be implemented. And one of the big things that I learned from that is that so you have these great solutions that can come out of these really dark periods in which people feel the solidarity that we should always feel that we are materially in this together. But those moments really highlight that. And then I think what then continues to highlight that are universal programs. And so I was a big believer in universal programs before I started this book, but I'm a much bigger believer now in that I've seen that they're not just more effective, more efficient, more, less wasteful, but importantly, they act as these what Robbie Nelson from Democratic Socialists of America would call vehicles of solidarity, where again that material reality. If you like in Finland, if everyone has to send their kid to the local school, we're going to make that local school the best possible school. And you had in Finland, teachers and parents fighting for this type of education, for a universal public school education system that was equitably funded and that actually gave more attention and more funding to students who needed it, which was a really radically different approach from what other countries took at a time in which they had very few resources. They really decided that this was the way to go, and they invest in their education system. Coming back to the UK and the National Health Service, I've reported on for The Nation how over the years, especially since the 1980s, since Margaret Thatcher, but under Tony Blair and subsequent Labour governments as well, you've seen an underfunding and a stealth privatization of this once incredible system. And although it's still free at the point of delivery and funded by general taxation, sort of the core principles of that universal healthcare system are still there, it has so many problems linked to these issues that I'm talking about. And so the other lesson that I learned there is that even when you have these really wonderful things, you're going to have to keep fighting for them. And you have unions in the UK who are fighting to to reverse this privatization and underfunding in the NHS. You have civil society groups and activists who are, Keep Our NHS Public, that are every single day highlighting how this is happening, especially when people can't feel it directly, because again, they're still getting quality care free at the point of delivery, but so maybe don't realize that their ambulance service has been privatized and what that means. That the fight doesn't end once we have the policies, that we have to keep going, and that there will be no end to how people or parties or moneyed interests especially will try to take these things away, no matter how beloved they are.
Well, it's an interesting thing that you bring up. A couple things and I loved the way you talked about the necessity for solidarity, like places where we can meet and exercise our solidarity with one another. Being in the States, that's a very serious point to make, because for a couple of different reasons. One being, answer that question: if you live in America, where do we gather to demonstrate our common humanity? It becomes harder and harder because there is the elimination of the middle class has I would say it's a reason why the arts community is so largely defunded. I would even say it's the reason why so many philosophical departments in colleges are being gotten rid of. Colleges are now about, and universities are about, job prep. It's not about different kinds of explorations that they traditionally have been for. Same thing happening with journalism. I mean, Natasha, you know this very, very well. The fact that there are 4 or 5, 6 corporations controlling all information that we get, we're finding these different ways for independent journalism to survive. So all of that said, this becomes for me a question of what is happening with the culture. Because if we had a place where we could apply our values, celebrate our values, and then signal to people who, find those values frivolous or unnecessary, that they are part of us, then it's not even so much of like, how are we going to fight to maintain them? It becomes the new normal. Right. And I talk to those of you who have had conversations with me about this. I am a student of the late 1950s, 60s, early 70s. For me, that's when that generation did not look for the permission from politicians. It was just like, we are going to inhabit the world that we live in, and we have fashion. We have, the feminization of society. You have the civil rights movement, right? And all of this stuff, it had a soundtrack. It had music, had the involvement of the arts community, it had theater, film, all of these things to sort of be like, yeah, isn't life a great jazz experience, And so my argument has always been, if we can figure out how to reinvigorate the culture and inhabit the culture in a way, it becomes a juggernaut that demonstrates the cheapness and how thin and how cruel politics are, which then will make it sort of much less of a threat. Because I still think when it comes to activism, and this is where we can all sort of like throw our opinions in here, people don't know how to do it. People don't know. They're made to feel uncomfortable if they go to a place, particularly now. I mean, as I said earlier, I've no longer am a teacher at the University of Pennsylvania because it became just like all other, particularly the Ivy Leagues. You show up and hold up a sign that says, peace. God forbid you hold one up that indicates there's a genocide happening in Gaza. If you're a student, you might not even graduate, If you're a senior, you'll have your job rescinded, right? So there are these penalties that are being demonstrated for people who just really want to create a future and a present that says life is worth living. You can say that that's that's a political act, but I think it's wrong. I think that if we just focus on celebrating what life is about, and then make ourselves recognize the fact that, again, that we're precious and we're worth saving, we become ultra sensitive to the bullshit that we're slowly accepting as normal. And I don't want that to happen. So if you guys want to talk about what your opinions are on that, I would love to hear them.
Yeah. I mean, I'll start because I have to lift up our dear sister Natasha's work on an issue that's near and dear to me. That needs to be transmitted even more. And I'm actually going to ask Natasha to come onto my program as well to talk about this at length. But Natasha produced an article in The Nation, and it's journalists like Natasha and Wen Stevenson that still give me faith in The Nation, I will say. But Natasha wrote this piece on what's happening in a small, little known South American country with a beautiful capital, Uruguay. And that the fact that there are 97% renewable energy, right? This is a piece that you would think would be making headlines specifically in the so-called U.S. climate movement, right? And I call it a so-called movement because it's more of a network than a movement. You know, here we are purporting we want 100% renewable energy by 2050, which is far too late, by the way. And Natasha writes this piece. And the question is, why isn't it, getting picked up more? And this goes back to what, Comrade Terry was talking about with the institutionalization, of activism, even telling us what's right and what's wrong. And, I would argue that there have been pieces that Natasha has written, certainly pieces that I've written, where there are consequences or there are potential consequences. We've seen it with your artwork, Brother Fish. But going back to what Comrade Terry said and to what you were talking about the 50s, specifically the 50s, I want to, harp on, there was an element of sacrifice that was assumed for the stances that you were going to take. And this also could be applied to the 1960s civil rights epoch, that, it wasn't going to be sort of being heralded on social media or becoming, to Brother Terry's point, a social media influencer. There was the threat of bullets, not just losing your job, but losing your life. And you make a decision on whether or not you're going to continue with this. And I think that has been taken away from us, in institutionalized activism. Look at the climate community's relative silence on the genocide going on in Russia right now. I mean, this is people who are some of the best climate activists, by the way, are people who are Christian, the most ardent. But we didn't hear a lot from the likes of Bill McKibben, who was a leader of the U.S. Climate Network and an avowed Christian, a Sunday teacher, for goodness sake. And as we got closer to the 2024 elections, it was kind of a bulletin was sent out. Oh, let's not talk about this too much because we have to win an election. And it's like, guess what? By not talking about it is a big reason why you lost that election, amongst many other reasons that we don't need to get into. So when I see pieces like Natasha's and I see the ardence of Brother Terry, and of course the sacrifices that you've made, Brother Fish, it reminds me that is an element that has to be included. And I'm not talking about, I say this as an anti-Zionist Jew who loves and believes in the story of a revolutionary Palestinian named Jesus, who some people may have heard about, right? Because the story and the teachings are so Jewish that it's like, what's the problem, guy? To my other fellow Jews, it all makes sense to me. But so I'm not talking about sacrifices and I'm going to get nailed to a cross, but what it does remind me of is my dear sister Marla Markham, speaking of Christian ardent climate fighters, who said we have to be brave enough to let things break into tiny little pieces and then strong enough to build something better. That to her was the embodiment of Jesus Christ. I told this to Brother West, and Brother West just kind of, one of his famous stares with his mouth open, my God, brother. Right? And so I think that a lot of that has been missing, because I'm wondering from Natasha's standpoint, why wouldn't the New York Times, write about a nation intentionally underdeveloped, right, as many other, colonized nations, that is literally leading the world right now in renewable energy production? Could it be because Natasha's article is also lifting up that this is not possible with privatization in energy production and utilities, right? This is state-owned power, and that's what needs to be done. But the boldness of stories like that, the boldness of your art, and the conviction of Terry has to be brought back, because what has happened to our activism, unfortunately, a term that our dear brother Olafemi Taiwo, brilliant journalist, professor at Georgetown, his book Elite Capture, right? We have seen many of our institutions get elite captured, and especially Black radicalism. I mean, my goodness, you talk about the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The 70s was the beginning of that elite capture of radicalism from, Black circles. What happened with CORE and the Ford Foundation and et cetera. Even what happened to Brother Jesse after 88, like deals, as Hedges would say, Terry, Faustian agreements made with the Democrats and the results of that. So, I mean, I think that we're at a point that we have to reclaim it, and we have to reclaim it quickly, Brother Fish, because unlike the 50s, 60s, and 70s, we don't have the luxury. Well, not that we had the luxury of time then, but we really don't now. Climate crisis doesn't care. It really doesn't care. Like, all right, activists, I'll wait for you to get your shit together, and then and in the meantime, I will reduce the extremity of my impacts on especially poor and working class people. We have to reclaim it, very, very quickly, and that and I think I've heard Terry say this, and I certainly see it through your actions and Natasha's work. It starts with conviction. It starts and ends with conviction. If you don't have it, we're pretty much screwed
Well,
right now.
I would say too, with conviction, but also one thing that we have got to do as activists is is make it believable to people who are so far right now not involved that they're not alone. Like, so how do we show each other that the community is there, that we are actually standing shoulder to shoulder? Intellectually, emotionally, yes, we can do it. Spiritually, we can do that. But how do we apply that then to the action that demonstrates also that we're standing shoulder to shoulder?
One quick thing I'll say to that is that, I mean, it's kind of like an issue I've had with these 50-51 and, fight oligarchy rallies. It's like, you mean to tell me you had 25 or 5,000, 10, 20,000 people together and you didn't ask them to do anything specifically, right? Besides just show up and hold up signs?
Right.
It's insulting, that they think that that's all people want to do, when we know that there are people out there who would be willing to put it all on the line, to Brother Terry's point, if they were just led in that direction. We don't want people to think that showing up alone, maybe that's all some people can do. I don't want to diminish that. But if you're not using that those rallies as organizing opportunities, right? Because that's what the far right does.
Yeah.
You come together and then you get sent back home with marching orders. And unfortunately, it's been working quite well.
That are also cultural marching orders. I mean, that gives back to what I was saying about the culture. If we can engender our values into something other than politics, Brother Anthony, I know that your base is probably within arm's reach right now. I'm sure that we all have different ways to unwind. Like, what do we do when we're not engaged with just like screaming about injustice, right?
Oh man. Well,
Right?
I've got a really big pile of records that I spend way too much money on. Number one, I play my bass guitar, and make music. I play around with my evil cats, Evil Ernie and Malachi, the Mayhem Maker, and I mean, my partner, she leads an amazing organization, or really a formation called Free Farm Syndicate. Like, straight up, they just grow a bunch of food and give it away to people for free, no strings attached, no thick forms to fill out, and helping her out in the fields, whether it's by choice or not, and she'll be like, get your ass off the computer and come outside right now and help me, get this food prepared, get your hands in the dirt, get your feet on the ground. And to that point, like you said, it's like, I can make a difference without having anything to do with politics, with culture, creating a culture of care, of just like, we are going to grow and give you food simply because people need to eat. And that is like,
That's
just real quick, that's a great distraction, but it's a distraction that leads to good things. So it's like, a double
100%.
benefit.
Well, that's the key word, I think, the distraction piece, because as we enter into this new era of terror, of real existential worry, this feeling of being impotent, not being able to change things, you're facing now a population that is going to be looking for some alleviation of that anxiety, right? So where does that population go? right? Where does it retreat to? And this is an argument, again, this is a whole nother show, but I mean, a lot of what the MAGA movement is about is trying to calm the fact that the elites, and we're talking about, the Democrats here, have ignored their pain for quite a long time. Right. So where do you go? Yes, I'll go into a fiction that has, heroes and villains in it, and I will fall behind, the proud leader that is, of course, it's a demagogue in this authoritarian situation. But what these people are looking for, they're looking for a narrative that gives them some sense of hope, right? Or some sense of recognition that they are actually part of something. So that's, I think, again, one of the things that I think that we all, not to pat all of ourselves on the back here, but I think that that is a through line through much of what we are trying to do, which is, yes, there is the politics, but what is the real story under this? I see you for something other than a political pawn in in a game that is being fabricated by people who are disgusting. Life is, we have to celebrate life and make life livable and a kick, for lack of a better word. We got to make it sexy and fun and just enjoy ourselves, So I haven't heard it. Terry, you got your water, so I can't wait to hear. I would love for you to have like a British accent now.
Oh, I wish. I wish. Unfortunately, you're stuck with my Appalachian drawl. Sorry. I am not optimistic. And I will tell you just what I've been feeling while I'm listening to this conversation. And I'm going to draw it into terms of three things, which is, as you know, Fish, it's always a count of three for me. I like to distinguish between activism, proactivism, and reactivism. Okay, just kind of off the top of my head. And I've lived over a decade now, as Fish well knows, in a rage of grief and an agony of futility. That's a mantra for me. Another one is when I wake up in the morning, I have two questions to deal with. Who am I to be and what am I to do? And I exhaust that by the end of the day. And it exhausts me just chasing those answers. I think we've come through a healthy period of activism, especially in the 50s and 60s, because of what we accomplished. The precursor to that was the pre-World War II and post-World War II New Deal era, if you want to think of it in those terms. That's where things, and then there was the Peace Corps and civil defense, and a lot of nice, ripe fruit came out of those traumas. But they came out of trauma. And I think that the real horrific defeat of hope that we face is we've never seen the trauma like we're going to be seeing within the next single digit of years. We've never seen anything like this. So we're going to migrate en masse, subliminally, I think, out of activism and proactivism into reactivism. And I'll give you a great example. We moved here into this neighborhood where I'm just barely, after being here 3 years, beginning to get to know my neighbors, because we all are aware of the differences that alienate us and we can't talk about them because it's a red state. And we had a hurricane. Now I live in Florida. Hurricane season is already beginning. It hasn't even begun to hit yet. But we had like a category 3, 4 hurricane right after I moved in. We moved in here, blew off part of our roof. I didn't know anybody. All 4 of my neighbors came over and picked the pieces of the shingles up off the ground, climbed up on the roof and put it up, because I can't climb up on a roof at my age. I mean, trust me, I'm going to fall and break a neck, which might not be a bad thing. But anyway, they come over. I don't know their names. They don't know my name. They brought ladders and hammers and nails, and they climbed up on the roof, patched it back together like a jigsaw, and it kept us dry on the inside until we could get a blue tarp over it. That's reactivism. And that's the spirit of community that we want to reach. But we can't tap into it. It has to get our attention. And that's what's going to happen. Right now, we don't have to persuade anybody. We probably can't, 99 times out of 100, change anybody's thinking, motivate them, activate them, awaken them, and all of that. I've given up on trying that. I'll just be honest with you, because I know before I can make that happen one on one or in mass, we're going to have a hurricane. And after that hurricane, we're going to gather at the guy's house who had a generator and thank him. You see what I'm saying?
I do see what you're saying.
Nature is winning this argument
Yeah,
for
yeah,
us if we'll get out of its way.
yeah. That said, I think that everybody's light comes on at a different time. I do think that there's certain things that we can't predict as far as what is going to engender some sort of change that is then going to become, uh, you know, viral, applicable, and useful. I mean, because prior to, I you keep getting, back to Natasha's book, prior to Natasha's book, and one of the things that many reviewers have said is it's it's a very necessary book, and it's so obvious that it should have been written already. So when it comes to sort of like common sense and practical knowledge and stuff, I think that we do. Terry, I can be with you 100%, as far as if I apply sort of critical thinking from an intellectual point of view to sort of where we are right now, 100%. I just, looking at the numbers, we're doomed, right? That said, there is something inside of me. I wake up every day with a great deal of optimism, because there's something about living for me that I try to live as incrementally, circumstantially as I can. The fact that I am able to connect moment to moment to moment to moment to moment, and to look at this, like this to me, what we're doing here is very beautiful and very meaningful to me. And this is me celebrating life. This is why I convened this conversation, because I love each and every one of you and really respect what you're doing. This to me, the fact that the world has not blown up yet during the course of our conversation, to me is a reason for optimism. Now, if I can string enough of those things together, look for the camaraderie of other people who also can feel that, because all we have is the moment that we're in, string this together, make this a meaningful thing, then the treachery, I can only hope that's all that I can do, will fall away, because it's going to become useless to each incremental person that gets involved with this kind of caring. And you experience it in your yard. You didn't know that was going to happen. That was a surprise to you. So if we can create circumstances where people can be surprised by the charity of other people, give other people the grace and the ability to demonstrate that they're love and concern for their fellow human being, because that also feels good, then I like to think that that is intrinsic to who we are. When our behavior to sort of ignore that is something that we're taught. I think that the things that we don't have to be taught is the fact that our life is worth caring about, and our community is worth supporting and loving, right? I
One of the
don't
things,
learn that. That's at the center of me.
well, I resonate with that, Fish. I really do, because here's the contradictory side of my right brain at work, thank God. One of the great mistakes that I think culturally and socially in the West we've made is social Darwinism. And that is a monstrous beast that is devouring civility and giving oligarchs and corporatists the power they have. Well, my favorite go-to philosopher, Charles Sanders Peirce, wrote a paper in the early 1900s called Evolutionary Love. And it was a counter-argument against Darwin. And this is an American philosopher who wrote this. And his whole thesis in that essay on metaphysics is the power, the force, the energy of nature is unconditional, agape love, not eat or be eaten, not kill or be killed, not the fittest, survival of the fittest, none of that. He called it the gospel of greed. That's social Darwinism.
Right.
Now, that's what gets me, like you were describing, Fish, that's what gets me from one moment to the next through that rage of grief, through that agony of futility, is where I can, especially with my family, especially those grandkids, find that little spark of unconditional love in that moment. And that's enough. That's enough. And you're right on point, all three of you, when you point out that if we can fan that flame around that spark communally, we'll at least die well.
Well, let's end this then with not with that specifically, but you're going to. So what I'm going to ask then is just a way to sort of end everything is uh, personally, like, what is your strategy moving forward right now, given everything that we're doing? Okay. Because I'm going to leave. If I, the more I talk to Terry, the more he will sort of step away from fanning that little spark. So I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave. I caught you, with some optimism, and I'm going to now shut off your mic. And I'm going to move to Anthony and Natasha just to talk about like where you are now, what your immediate plans are for, contributing to this, to giving a shit and helping save each other and so forth. So yeah.
Yeah, so Aaron Glantz, who's an excellent journalist, he's the author of Homewreckers about the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, among other excellent books. He once said to me, and to a lot of other people at an event we did, that journalism, even when reporting on really heinous crimes, is an inherently optimistic endeavor because it's founded in the belief that things can get better, that we're reporting on these issues so that things can improve. And that is one thing that I think about often. I mean, as you can hear, I'm writing about these successes. And so I was looking for optimism quite deliberately, and I'm going to continue looking for optimism deliberately, looking at city policies in my next book and what we can do on a smaller scale. I'm really heartened by things like what are happening in New York with Zohran Mamdani. We can't put all our eggs in one leader's basket, but certainly it's exciting to see people with these bold ideas and have these mass movements behind them. And that's where I think why Anthony's work is so important, that we can't have these leaders that aren't accountable to these mass grassroots movements, because they will, sell out inevitably, as we've seen so many times. But just to go back to this, what we do in our off time, or when I'm not a journalist, or I guess I'm wearing a different hat, is I read and write and teach poetry. And one of the poems, and there's just, I found a lot of community there. I've been really hopeful by how so many young people are coming to spoken word or coming to poetry for community, but also for politics. And so there are so many poems that I could read, but if you all allow me just to read the end of a poem that's been on my mind recently, which is June Jordan's "I Must Become a Menace to My Enemies." And I think really it's we must become a menace to our enemies. And if I ever let you slide, who should be extirpated from my universe, who should be cauterized from earth completely, land and order jerk-offs of the first terrorist degree, then let my body fail my soul in its bedeviled lecheries. And if I ever let love go, because the hatred and the whisperings become a phantom dictate, I obey in lieu of impulse and realities, the blossoming flamingos of my wild mimosa trees. Then let love freeze me out. I must become a menace to my enemies.
Sweet. All right, Anthony. Now, what are you going
I
to say?
mean, there it is. I mean, if Natasha's going to start the trend of lifting up the words of badass Black women whose words possibly are more salient and germane now than when they wrote them. I mean, I'll start with Audre Lorde. I mean, her quote, I call it an aphorism, really, is "survival is a promise," and right. That takes on the idea of hope, but it also lifts up a sentiment of duty. Right, you got to have hope plus duty, and so what I'm trying to do now is a lot what Natasha just said. I mean, I think one of the first intervention points in systems of oppression and, you know, the horrible systems is narrative, right? We like to say that the narrative can represent the seeds of what you're trying to grow. I mean, everything that comes out of that narrative is going to impact your base building, your organizing, your policy development, your electoral strategy, your direct action, which are the other points of intervention. But really, you know, just going in and reclaiming that narrative that another world literally is possible. And we have a duty to organize for alternative systems, because otherwise, as the great, speaking of more badass black women, Miriam Kaba asks us, if you're not organizing for alternative systems, then what the F are you doing? Like what exactly is the point of your work if we're not organizing for alternative systems and showing that these alternative systems can work? It's really interesting because in trying to learn more about this, I've actually been studying, you know, more right-wing movements, you know, who have gone off grid and who have organized alternative systems, albeit systems that I don't want to see proliferate because of the philosophy that they hold, but the tactics that they are using that are even bringing in some elements of what people would call the left, but you know, bringing those elements in, the so-called Make America Healthy Again movement, you know, for instance, you know, it's appealing even to environmental nonprofits, you know, but those are all examples of alternative systems that, you know, we should be building as well, you know, without the white supremacy, colonization, and patriarchy would be a lot more preferred, obviously. And I think that that starts also with, you know, a renaissance of some of our leaders who have either been forgotten or intentionally written out of our narrative. I'm talking about people like Hubert Harrison, the amount of people who don't know that this man, who was the mentor for Marcus Garvey, who created the largest black organization, but was also critical of Garvey because of his sexism, because of his capitalism. And Harrison talking about sexual liberation of women and their bodies in that early, you know, 20th century. It's no wonder he was written out of history, you know, but bringing, you know, that back as part of our narrative. I agree with Natasha. I'm really into localization and municipalization right now. Been very, very intrigued and inspired by the writings of like Maury Bookchin, Eric Olin Wright, and old you know, departed comrades, you know, like that. And then, you know, land liberation, and, you know, and what that means. We have these amazing examples going back to the so-called developing world. I like to say maybe they are the developing nations because they're developing shit that leads to solutions faster than we are, right? Uruguay, 97% renewable energy. Nicaragua about to hit 70%, you know, this year. But then we're also seeing landless movements in Brazil. We know about the Zapatista, just, you know, what they have been doing in Mexico for, you know, and bringing that into a context of the United States for all oppressed people is really what I'm interested in. What I'm not interested in right now is sort of like this idea that policy is going to save us, an election here or there is going to save us, and that we put all of our eggs in the basket of a few pieces of words that are signed by older white men, and therefore, you know, see, you know, you're safe, and getting people to understand that even the work that I do, which is like, you know, policy work, you know, for the most part, I hate policy. My mom paid a lot of money for me to get degrees in policy, so like it's like it really an homage to her that I'm using it in doing this work, but I absolutely hate it, you know, and whatnot. But that woman made a lot of sacrifices for me to go to the universities that I did. And but you know, making people understand that policy is a tool, but not the tool. To what Terry was just talking about, you know, the mutual aid, you know, is going to save us more than any policy, and certainly faster than FEMA. Terry's probably still waiting on FEMA, you know, to make him whole again. But the idea of like getting to know your neighbor and community coming together, that's an alternative system of like, the hell with you. We're not going to wait for the federal government we can't. We have no time to wait for the federal government. Terry's going to get wet. People are going to go without food and water. So we're going to do that ourselves. And which is something that is always done in developing nations. As you know, Brother Fish, I spent a lot of time in Colombia with my mentor, Jamu Baraka, and the work that we do down there with Francia Marquez and whatnot. And he was just explaining the differences during the pandemic or the height of the pandemic there. It wasn't competition of people not saying to each other, oh, eggs are going to be, here, like don't tell anyone else. It was literally kids riding their bikes in neighborhoods and saying, this store has eggs today, or this store has this today. And so everybody, knew about it. And that sense of community is what's going to save it. One of, Natasha's colleagues at The Nation, when Stevenson, his amazing new book called Learning to Live in the Dark, just talking about how depressed he's been in the height of this climate crisis. But the challenge for him is, what do we do to retain our collective humanity? That's all that really matters, at this point. Not a grand piece of policy, Green New Deal, not more wind turbines, not more solar panels, although we need a lot of that as well. But our collective humanity, if that is not retained, then it doesn't matter. And I'll lift up one last badass woman before I get off my soapbox. I mean, Rosa Luxemburg, socialism or barbarism. And then, that's becoming a lot more true these days. We're starting to see that Karl Marx and Lenin weren't just, really good writers and political thinkers, but they were actually quite prescient as well.
Right.
And I think, bringing those lessons to not just like my community, but, and I'll end on this, is that my biggest goal is to help people to remember that it's going to take a multiracial, multi-ethnic, intergenerational, collection of people in order to usurp what we're dealing with right now. Like, there has to be Black liberation, but there can't be Black liberation if there's not liberation of all poor people, right? There has to be Indigenous liberation, et cetera, et cetera. So that's really the thing, is breaking down these damn and annoying silos that have been put up purposely by our institutions to separate us and prevent us from building, collective power. I got into an argument with Bill McKibben, who I, named earlier, because he had said something once about, the People's Climate March that took place in New York, I think it was 2015, 2016, where he said, we don't want this to be another battle for Seattle. And I was like, the hell we don't. You know what I mean? Like, what do you mean we don't want it to be another battle in Seattle? We have 500,000 people here. Now is the time to make it another battle for Seattle, where we did see this conflation of labor, environmentalists, women's rights groups, Black liberation, Indigenous and whatnot, and then we were separated by 9/11, unfortunately. But bringing that, back together in an authentic way, where people can still retain their identity, which is everyone's identity is beautiful, but bring that identity into service of something much larger than a singular identity, but a collective identity for liberation.
It's all about the collectivity. I mean, it's all about the community and keeping each other close and listening to each other and keeping our minds clear and our hearts full of love when we can. All right. So thanks, you guys. Thanks for chatting with me today, and let's stay in touch and go save the fucking world.